Annual Startup Boston Week. My name is Samantha and I'll be your host. And a huge thank you to Suffolk University Sawyer Business School for hosting this conference. As you may have noticed arriving, this location is the perfect hub for exploring Boston's innovation ecosystem and learning from industry leaders. The goal behind Startup Boston Week is to connect the entire greater Boston and New England startup community, all industries, all startup departments, and all bootstrapped and funding stages for 5 days of learning and connecting with one another. The team that creates Startup Boston Week is primarily volunteer, and the folks working the conference today here are volunteering their time as well. So thank you for attending this conference. It is a labor of love, and we appreciate you playing a role in shaping our startup community. Thank you so much again for attending. Now on to the session. Go ahead, Steve.
Hi. I'm so relieved that all the panelists made it. Can you hear me okay? Great. So I'm Steve Dickman. I'm the CEO of CBT Advisors. We'll all give our bios in a moment, but I just wanted to ask the audience, so what are your backgrounds? We realize this is a cross-industry, cross-stage kind of conference, so let's ask for show of hands, life sciences versus tech and everything else. Life sciences people? Okay, and tech and everything else, that's the rest of you. Okay, good to know. We are all life sciences people, but from very different ends of the industry. And now I'm going to turn to the panelists, have them introduce themselves, and we'll get started. But just before we do, this is going to be very interactive. We're going to give bios. Everybody's going to give a kind of an opening statement, if you will. And I'm going to then ask for audience questions, and we're going to keep it very open. So, Jim, you just got here. Why don't you start?
Oh, Boston traffic. I started 3 hours ago, and I live in Bedford, 15 miles away. Crazy, right? Anyway, pleasure to be here. My name is Jim Weissman. I've been in the biotech and pharmaceutical industry for 40 years. I know that's impossible given my youthful appearance. The first 20 years was in big pharma, most of it abroad, actually in Asia and Europe. I worked notably for Pharmacia and then Pfizer. And then the next 20 years, I worked in biotech. The last 10 years, I was the chief operating officer and chief business officer of a company named Dicerna, which had a really terrific exit in 2021. Since that time, I've been advising other companies in licensing, strategy, business development, and exits. Pleasure to be here.
Thank you, Jim. Andrew?
Great, thanks. Andrew Miller, founder and former president of R&D at Karuna Therapeutics. I'm a scientist by training. I've spent the last really 15 years in biotech, particularly on the early stage side of things. Spent most of really that 15 years working in mental health and psychiatry specifically, which is an area that I think is really in need of innovation and has been an area largely ignored by many companies in the industry. Had the good fortune of inventing a technology that became our lead program. We have our PDUFA date actually here in a couple of weeks, potentially for approval in schizophrenia, and then transitioned into an advisor consulting role with the acquisition of Karuna by Bristol Myers Squibb earlier this year.
Thank you, Andrew. It's a pleasure to have you here. Martha?
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Martha Shaden. I am a serial entrepreneur. However, the first half of my career, I worked for very large companies like Covidien and Zimmer Biomet. Second half, running and operating startup companies. I'm now retired and have the pleasure of serving on multiple boards. And I advise other startup companies passionate about women leaders in medtech.
Thank you, Martha. Kristen?
Hi, guys. Glad to be here in the last session of the day. Kristen King. So I have been with companies biotech for about 27 years. I'd say a third in R&D. I'm a bioengineer many moons ago. And a third in marketing. And then the last probably 13, 14 years in business development, M&A. So love the biotech space. I am also an angel investor with Boston Harbor Angels. We are industry agnostic, so I see a lot of really cool stuff in different areas. And from an M&A front, that's probably my first intro into startups was targeting M&As to look to acquire and bring into big companies.
Thank you. And I'm Steve Dickman. I'm CEO of CBT Advisors. We're a consultancy in Cambridge. Been working for 21 years next month on storytelling, and all with life sciences clients, including a few from medical technologies, most of them from biopharmaceuticals. The last 10 plus years of the practice, we've focused mostly on drafting S1 business sections, IPO prospectus text for companies telling their story for the first time to a wide audience of investors. And I've gotten to work with both Andrew and Jim on drafting S1 business sections, which was hugely educational for me, I must add. Prior to that, I was a reporter for 10 years. I worked for Nature, for Science, for The Economist, and a venture capitalist for 4 very interesting, very intense years, about 200 yards from here in downtown Crossing. So I wanted to open this by asking the panelists to talk a little bit about their general philosophy or their general view on building companies for exit. I mean, obviously, we all build companies, and obviously, we all need liquidity. It doesn't necessarily mean that you have to exit. I mean, there are some 50, 100-year-old companies out there that have never exited in some way. They've had an IPO, maybe some of them are privately held. There's some really powerful private companies out there, never exited. But in our industry, where investors need liquidity, we're all thinking about exits all the time. And what I want to accomplish for the panel and through your questions is, well, what does that actually mean in practical terms? If you're working for an early stage, very early stage company, if your company is just an idea, how do you think about exit? What are the sort of principles to operate by? And you couldn't have 4 better people to talk about that from different perspectives in the industry. And I'm just going to go right back to Jim again, because he was the first one on our prep call to go, and he gave a great launch for this discussion. Jim, go ahead.
Well, I don't remember what I said on the launch call, but I do
Oh,
have
just
something
make it
to
up,
say.
Jim. You'll be
Okay.
fine.
I've never played 3-dimensional chess. I've seen it on TV. It's one of the games in Big Bang Theory, if any of you have ever seen that sitcom. But actually, if you think of an exit, any complex system is something like 3-dimensional chess. There's a certain number of tangents one can control, him or herself, and there's a whole bunch of things that happen in the external environment that you really don't have much control of. Another way to say it is luck comes to those who are prepared. So when I think of being prepared for an exit, I'm of course speaking in the context of biopharmaceuticals, but hopefully people in high tech can take some learnings from this. I see it as 3 Ps. The 3 Ps actually create value. In the biotech context, those Ps are pipeline, platform, and partnerships. And if you get those 3 things right, you've got a pipeline that makes sense, you have a platform that actually may produce 1 or more drugs, and you're actually continuously talking to the outside world in terms of what do potential partners think. I think then you can actually start playing 3-dimensional chess. What I did say on the prep call was the importance of diligence and being able to tell your story. So when you are in a partnering conference, a banking scenario, meeting new investors, you have 10, maybe 20 minutes total, but actually only 10% of that is the time that you get to make a good first impression. And the way that you make a good first impression is by having a good story and the diligence materials to back it up for those parties who are interested.
And I'm going to follow up. What you said was the diligence materials, what goes into your data room, the gardening of your secret garden, your data room that you're only revealing to selected potential corporate partners or investors. Tell us how important that is and who should do it.
Yeah, how many in the audience are familiar with the term VDR, virtual data room? Right? Okay. So for those of you who aren't familiar, it's actually an electronic system that allows people to access your most confidential information. And so a virtual data room is a very important communication tool for qualified users. A qualified user would be an investor or a potential partner who's signed a secrecy agreement, for example, and has demonstrated legitimate interest in forming a more formalized relationship with your company. I like to joke around with a lot of my clients that their virtual data rooms remind me of vegetable gardens in people's backyards. You will find cucumbers and zucchinis and tomatoes. You will also find a lot of weeds, and it's the job of the executive who's in charge of the diligence room to ensure that the garden is weeded. You have the needed information in a concise and efficient way, and it looks professional. Not too professional. There's an art. Can't make it look too good, but you've got to actually tend your garden. You have to get rid of the weeds and cultivate your crop of data.
Yeah, it's a critical, large point, actually, that Jim is making. It sounds narrow, like, oh, the data room, there should be a qualified person, but it's a critical, critical point that for an entrepreneur, you are always communicating. You are always putting out a message about yourself, about your professionalism, about the way that you build your company, the way that you work with your employees or colleagues. And what goes into the data room is definitely going to leave behind an impression for someone coming in from outside, making a maybe not a first impression, but an important and lasting impression. And so Jim's totally right. It's not just about the person who does it. It's not just about the data that's in it. It's not just about how polished is it. It's an overall. Andrew.
Yeah, happy to speak a little bit to this. I mean, I think from a strategic perspective, one thing that was really important for us, we were a public company for 5 years prior to the acquisition. So you talk about data room and being organized and having infrastructure, those things were all important. We could tell a few stories about that. But I think when you think about how we built the company, we had about 350 employees at the time of the acquisition. We were less than a year away from launching a product. We had a plan to hire about 450 people in the calendar year 2024. And that was really all guided by the idea that we were prepared to do everything on our own. That's what our vision was. That's what we communicated to the outside, to investors, to partners, to our employees, because that's what we wanted to do. That's what we had a passion to do. We had a passion to make a difference, and we're on track to do that. I think there's also behind that a strategy of how do you find an exit or an acquisition or a partnership. We'd been through an IPO process. It's a little different on the biotech side since we're so capital intensive. But there was always an undercurrent of we knew this could happen at some point. We had particular periods of time when we thought people might approach us. Sometimes people did, sometimes people didn't. But we were always very focused on making sure that we had optionality. If we didn't have the option to do it on our own, we had the chance, or we could have suffered the fate of finding ourselves at a dead end where we weren't capable of moving ourselves forward. And that did require a lot of time and real investments. We probably spent $50 million on CMC development, so chemistry, manufacturing, and controls, in the last 16 to 18 months prior to the acquisition, which in theory we could have not done and sold the company. But we needed to do that to prepare for moving forward. And so to me, it was always first and foremost, we're ready to do this on our own. If the right opportunity comes along, we're going to be in a position to do that as well. But we had to build this to accomplish everything we needed on our own.
Thank you. I just want to underscore what Andrew's saying is they were going to more than double the size of the company in order to launch the product commercially. And this was standard operating procedure. This was something that they felt they needed to be prepared to do, that they were ready to launch this drug and own the launch, be able to launch a drug that people are going to put in their bodies that's supposed to make them function better, people with severe psychiatric conditions. I mean, it's a big task, and it was a big task to get ready to hire all those people and to be interrupted at some point in the journey. That had to be a little hard.
Yeah, I mean, the importance of having an endless change of building and growing the company. I mean, from 2019 to 2024, we doubled the size of the company each consecutive year.
Each year.
Each year. And even actually, we were fortunate to go through the FTC and SEC review process relatively quickly. We were, give or take about 90 days from announcement of intention to actually closing the transaction. In that 90 days, we hired 50 people. Couldn't afford not to, right? If we had an extended FTC review, if we had, some material adverse thing that happened in the market or to BMS or otherwise, and the transaction didn't commensurate, there was no way we could have afforded to sit in our hands for 90 days. We were sitting there in December, 10 months ahead of PDUFA, with 10 months to get ready to launch a drug. We couldn't take a 90-day break or a 120-day break. And so there was an endless process, always ongoing, of change and growth. and that was really important to continue to maintain that. It required a lot of discipline through that diligence process or the process to close, right? You can imagine how much the environment changed, how people are thinking about it. They're worried about totally different things than they were before. It was a stress test for the company.
Thank you, Andrew. Sorry, Martha. I want to get to Martha and Kristen. I'm sorry to spend so much time on the biotech side. Martha, about M&A from day one, what does an entrepreneur need to be thinking about?
Yeah, so this is a huge topic, and we can't possibly cover everything in the time that we have, but let me bring forth a couple of things that represent my philosophy and approach. I believe that you start at the end, at the beginning. And what I mean by that is you have to have a pretty good idea of where you're going with the company. And we always knew that we were going to exit. We never believed it was going to be an IPO. This is med tech, and there's very few IPOs in med tech of our type. I'm in orthopedics, so we started there. I had the advantage of working for large multinational companies half of my career. So I sort of knew what the potential acquirers were looking for, but it's really important to understand that as the leader of a company, because you can spend a lot of time and a lot of money and resources and find out that you don't really have what the potential acquirers would be looking for. So at the very earliest, I started socializing the technology. And what do I mean by that? I would visit with the M&A folks at some of the potential acquirers, and we'd have conversations. I was bringing them along on the journey and making them aware of us, but I didn't do it too often. I did it when there was something material that changed in the company. Through those interactions, I started building a playbook of what we needed to do. So for instance, did we need a certain volume of, unlike biopharma, which has the benefit of exiting when they've done 2 patients in a study, med tech, and that's no joke, that happens all the time. With med tech, we're, especially in orthopedics, the potential acquirers are more conservative, and they need to see some kind of revenue traction with the company. And because we were creating a category, what we did was very new in the industry. We had even more of a burden of proof. So in one example, let me just give you a really quick example, is, we had conversations about, so what do you need to see in revenue? And their answer was, well, we're not wedded to any particular number, but what we do need to see is year-over-year growth. And more importantly, we need to see same-store growth, sales, meaning same physicians use the product over and over and over again. So a one and done is not going to get you very far. And if that's what your metrics show, that you have 100 physicians using the product once and they stop, that's a bad look. So those were the kinds of things that I knew sitting on the other side of the table, but was good for us to revalidate with some of the potential acquirers. I'll stop there because we got lots more to talk about.
I'm sure there'll be more, but that's a great start, Martha. Thank you. Kristen.
Yeah, I love your starting at the beginning, talking about the end. How many people here have ever pitched or tried to raise money? Okay. How many people have ever had an investor ask you, what's your exit strategy? Right? So honestly, it's really from day one, and I say that purely for a financial reason of it really ties into when you're thinking, whether you want to go IPO or you want to go to a partner, or say you have 3 platforms and you're going to license it and build the more you talk and how you're pitching, investors are asking this because they're trying to figure out how to connect where you are today with realistically, from an angel world, how they can come in and help and be like, oh, you can't go after 3 channels with this amount of money, to try to see where that path goes to not only an inflection point, but valuation, right? And that's, is your end game achievable in what you think you've got to start and how much more money you have to raise to get to a point where you can start to talk about that next either raise or maybe a strategic or an IPO, so that you're not upside down in thinking as far as your valuation and the multiples you think you make everyone dream, right? Angels, we love to make us dream, but if medtech, because most of my career was in medtech, the multiples just aren't the same as pharma. And if you look at SaaS, if you look at climate, we look at all of this, and it's a gut check on really, can you even make the multiples? But being in M&A for the last decade, you guys get paid last as the founders, right? And it's just a sin for all that work to say, don't dilute yourself out of the game, because you're common shares. And as you keep going up and raising money, it's all kind of knowing that at beginning with your founding team, what's your cap table, what's your valuation, the financials. And then if you're raising money, do you have to show a little revenue to get to the next level? So I say that to share the importance again of that financial advisor. And not everybody has to know finance, so get a fractional CFO, ask your investors for help, someone that can just take this and kind of map it out as you look at your strategy to get to that exit path.
And use the fractional CFO as an opportunity to pitch your business and see if that candidate for fractional CFO actually understands what you're saying, because that person is not well versed in your business. They may be very well versed in finance or maybe even in tech, but if they don't understand your pitch, you should go back to the drawing board. I wanted to follow up, because, Kristen, of your experience currently with the Boston Harbor Angels, you must see a lot of pitches.
Sure.
What are think of an example of an exit strategy question and answer to an entrepreneur, or an entrepreneur who proactively talked about exit strategy that you felt went over well, regardless of industry. What worked?
Basically, to be able to have an idea and know, even if there are multiple paths, and at a very high level, say, this is my founding team. I want to exit to a strategic or maybe IPO, and I want to do that in 5 years, and here's where we are today. And what didn't go so well is kind of when it's, well, it depends, and you can really tell when folks haven't thought it through, right? And, or if somebody says, I'm raising between 1 to 5, and it's the numbers and the math and the check. Know your audience and who you're pitching to. These are investors, right? These are dollars. And it's trying to not necessarily say you have to be exactly right, but does your story make sense? You've heard that repeatedly on this planet, on this planet. Yeah, but on this panel, it's the end of the day. Because honestly, everyone's trying to help you, because we need good new things out in the world, and can you get to where you want to go as a team? And some of the feedback is often like, we've all done commercial 3 markets. How are you going to break into physical therapy or something? Because we've seen other companies that just haven't been able to achieve that. So it's more of a feedback of maybe some excitement around, what are you guys doing that nobody else does? Or that reality check, or have you talked to any companies if you're trying to exit to somebody and saying, what are they saying? So it's really not having the deer in the headlight look. And I think, I saw it best when I do a lot of advising for Yale and brilliant technologies, and I think the award winners got up and gave this beautiful presentation, and nobody asked for money. And I was like, wow. So it's just being prepared, so you're not caught off guard. And even if you don't know the answers of financial, you can just pause and tell people the story of where you want to go in the next 2 to 4 years.
I mean, the point I would take from that, among several good points, Kristen, is it's not just know your audience as a person pitching. It's your story has to
Yeah.
be congruent with who you are, and it has to be then congruent with what the market is perceived to want. You may be able to move the investors a little on market size or opportunity, but mostly it's you and how well you and the story fit. Martha, I think you wanted to add something.
Well, I didn't, but I will.
Okay, please do.
So, Kristen, I'll ask you a question. How many times have you sat in front of a CEO and you've asked them what's your market size, and it's always $1 billion?
Yeah. Well, right now, I'm CBO for a company, and the founder's always like, well, we're just going to go get 10 billion. So, like, it's just constantly, and $1 billion, and I've been in wound care for 13 years. I don't know why everybody peaks wound care and thinks it's so easy, but everybody says $1 billion, and it's
Yeah.
that total, keep going.
Well, so I think.
Sam, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, Kristen makes an excellent point, and this is where you gain credibility or you lose credibility pretty easily. So in med tech, it's never $1 billion, okay? In pharma, that's a small number, so we're talking magnitudes of difference. But what she's talking about is know who your audience is, and the more you know who your target patient is, the more credible you are, and the more trust you build, either with an investor and or a potential acquirer. So I'll give you an example. I was advising for a company who has a technology, and they saw their technology as being about 750 million, the target, right? What they didn't realize was that half of that market were people who would never choose their technology because of price, right? But they didn't factor that in, or if they did, they were trying to pull one over on the investors who were very smart. And so they realized.
Well, we see a lot of pitches.
Right. And so you got to be careful about that. I do want to come back to Andrew's comment about optionality. That's huge. So it ties into the potential exit value of the company. If you are not careful and you're not strategic about where you spend your dollars, you can get yourself in a boatload of trouble where at the end of the day, you have no options, meaning that you're too expensive to be bought, and investors are going to shy away because they don't see the multiple exits that they would like to see. So you have to, that market size is a realistic market size is really, really, really important as you scale your business and understand what should you be spending.
That's excellent. I wanted to circle back to Jim because my experience of your last year and a half or 2 years is you are exiting Dicerna. They sold Dicerna for $3 billion. He was exiting. He was chief business officer for 10 years. 10 years. And he said, yeah, I'm just going to kick back, ride my bike, do a little consulting. And I turn around 1 year later, and you've done 10 deals as an advisor to startup and more advanced biopharmaceutical companies. So look across the 10 deals and look at Dicerna too, if you will. Give us an example from your recent experience of deal making done right, deal making done with forethought, the kind of cultivation of the garden metaphor, if you will. Think of something that really struck you as a success example where you would say, oh my God, I'll teach that in a business school class one day.
Well, it's really fun to be on this panel because I love everybody's perspective and I want to go deep on what people say, but we could go down the rabbit hole over and over again and that wouldn't be interesting. Deal making is a really strange profession. It's a high wire balancing act. You have to be humble and bold at the same time. You really can't be a jerk because companies actually are inanimate objects. So if you think about it, when a small biotech or a med tech wants to do a deal with a larger company, you've got to be likable, right? this is one of the things that I try to coach chief business officers, CEOs, and boards. Yes, we're all analytically gifted. We can all do sales forecasts and net present values, and we all understand intricate details of termination provisions of licensing agreements, et cetera. But actually, at the end of the day, companies are animated by the humans that work there, finding a way to communicate with the people who may have a very different perspective. Maybe the different perspective is a different language or culture or style of doing business in Japan versus Germany versus the US.
To be clear,
You've gotta
Jim,
know
Jim
that.
lived in Japan for years and he's fluent in Japanese. Fluent? Quasi-fluent?
Yeah,
And
pretty good.
they sold Dicerna to a Danish company.
Yeah.
So, quick
My-
difference.
my
Danish
s-
culture, Japanese business culture. Were there any differences or is it all
Well,
the same?
yeah, okay, here's something I made up. Confidential information, it's always in the eyes of the perspective from which you come. In the United States, nobody knows anything and everybody talks. In Europe, everybody knows and everybody talks. And in Japan, everybody knows and nobody talks. That's the way I've always put it together, living and working in those three regions. So when I see a deal going right, usually it's an amalgamation of timing. The window for deals opens and closes, and sometimes you have very little influence on that window closing. Let's just use a really hot area in biotech that I've never been involved in. I'm still not involved in it. It's gene therapy. So anybody who's been following the industry knows there was tremendous excitement about gene therapy 10 years ago. In fact, one of the projects I remember my boss at Dicerna gave me, which was fascinating, was run a case study of this gene therapy. Would you rather be in Dicerna or would you rather work in that gene therapy company? And then present it to the management team. It's a really interesting deal. He did that with other executives and other companies or therapy areas. And actually, if you think about gene therapies, there were so many amazing deals done, right? BioMarin was in the news last week and recently. They have a new CEO, and they have a new chief business officer, very famous guy, a lot of us know him. They did a huge hemophilia deal, and the product works. Unfortunately, the commercial reality hasn't led to success, and they've got to change their strategy, right? So the windows of opportunity open and close, and they're living organisms. They're breathing in and out. You've got to take advantage when that window is open, and that means you really have to be a blunt object inside the company, insisting that you've got to get this done now. And that, and so when I see things done well, an executive, it could be the CBO, the CEO, the CMO, they take responsibility and they ensure that everybody's on the same page and they're going to work to get this deal done. That's because timing is the enemy of all deals.
So, human factor, timing. Before we go to the panelists again, now I'm going to the audience. Should have gone to you even faster. Any questions? Anything you want to hear about from this panel? Anyone? Anything? Anything?
Pardon me? I drive a car that I purchased on Halloween in 2017 because at that time we were using code names that were cars for all of our partners, and we had a deal that just got done, and my old car was pretty dead, and so I haven't upgraded the car. I bought it on October 31st, 2017, right after doing a deal with a company codenamed a fancy car, not a Ferrari.
Not a Ferrari. Okay.
And it's gray, it's boring.
Oh, boy. And it didn't help you when taking the tea got me here early today. Just saying. Any other questions from the audience? Yes, please. Just tell us who you are, your affiliation. And wait for the microphone, even better. Totally, thank you.
Hi, can you hear me? Yes,
Yeah.
thanks. I'm an aspirational entrepreneur starting my journey. I currently have a Monday to Friday job, but I'm really passionate about entering the space. I was really curious about, Martha, what you shared about the thumb, right? And being really on top of what you are presenting and not overselling. But at the same time, if everyone is overselling, are you selling yourself short by being accurate, right? So how you think about, everyone is saying that it's $1 billion TAM in front of us, and here I come and say, well, it's actually 200 million, and then I'm selling short from the rest, right?
Don't worry about that. Be true to yourself. Tell the truth. Don't oversell. If you really believe it's $1 billion, okay, you're going to have to show them. But these are smart people that you're presenting to. And I'll tell you, you go a lot further, a lot faster if you start at a spot where you mean to end up with them. And so I built this kind of trust network that when they had a question about another company that they were buying or thinking about buying in the space, they would call me and say, what do you think about this company? Do you think that they really can do X, Y, Z? It will never, ever be a problem for you, and it will always serve you well. So just, I love what Steve said about not being a jerk. I mean, there's a lot of jerks out there.
Jim.
Jim, sorry, Jim. Sorry.
I would also say don't be a
Yeah,
jerk,
yeah.
but Jim said it
But,
first.
sorry, Jim, I don't know why I
worries.
mix the names up, but, yeah, I mean, just be true. Be honest and just be true to yourself, and it will serve you well.
I want to throw in something on top of that. It's a great question because I ran into this in venture all the time. And what I've learned over the many years is that the audience of investors can be parsed into subsets. And one of the arts of being a successful entrepreneur is knowing how to break down, how to parse that audience. And in your case, you might be looking at 5 investors, 4 of whom need to be wowed with $1 billion number, even if it's not true. And you have to ask yourself before you start pitching, do I want one of those investors on my board? Do I want an investor who insists on being lied to? Or am I willing to take the risk of pitching the 5th investor who is going to ding you immediately if you claim that the market's bigger than $250 million? But if you tell them truthfully, this is the market, they will actually invite you back for a second meeting just because you're the only entrepreneur that month who was bold enough to do that. It's how you break down the market.
Yeah, I mean, I would add a few things to that. I'd say the only people who are allowed to be assholes, if you can use that word, it's investors, not entrepreneurs, not partners. Right. This
And
was
you've
the
never
last-
been an investor as far as I know.
Yeah, not really as a professional, right? But so I think, but the point is, I do think you have to be nice and cordial and appropriate. I also think you have to be credible. And that doesn't matter whether you're raising $10,000 in angel financing
Right.
or hundreds of $millions as a public company or trying to close a transaction in a week, right? So in all of those situations, I think there was a lot of pride on my part and our part from a management team perspective of like, we were credible. We didn't oversell, we didn't undersell.
Right.
And that level of trust, I'd say trustworthiness and reputation that we had, when things got a little tough and a little dicey, you rely on that with the people who are important to you, right? And you know, I can think of oodles of public companies that we were competitors are, or you would see at this investor conference and this, investment banking conference. And you see management teams that you don't trust. You don't trust what they say. It changes a little bit from this earnings call to that earnings call. And I think across all of that range of, company with no money worth nothing to billions of dollars. And I think that concept of being credible and trustworthy, if you lose it, it's really, really hard to get back.
Yeah.
And it only takes one short period of time where you're making the wrong decision to lose it. So to me, I think that's extremely important regardless of the scale of the company, the industry, whatever it may be.
Another question.
I love that you're talking about credibility, but I have a couple of questions for you about credibility.
Are you a startup person? Tell us a little bit about yourself.
I'm an executive coach, leadership coach.
Great.
I work with a lot of social entrepreneurs.
Okay.
So when you're doing something new, out of the box, different, what is your advice to build that credibility?
I mean, I think there's I feel like I've been in a position where I would tell you of the first 200 people that I talked to raise money for Karuna, 199 of them said no. And there's a whole litany of reasons for that. Some reasonable, some that had to do with us, some that didn't have to do with us. And to me, I think that credibility was about a consistency and that they saw sort of a passion of like, I believe in this. I'm going to tell you why I believe in it. I'm not going to be unwilling to talk about what those points of skepticism are. In fact, I'm going to tell you, here's how what I'm going to do with this investor capital is going to reduce that skepticism and build that value. And that there's always points of skepticism, right? For us, it was very early on about intellectual property. We had a drug that Lilly discarded 25 years ago that we were pitching as a completely new class of treatment in schizophrenia, which hadn't seen one in 70 years. There's a lot of skepticism in that, and a lot of people who looked at that and said no before a word even came out of my mouth, right? But there was a consistency and a persistence in that and finding the right audience for that. Went to some pretty non-traditional financing places in the early days to raise our first couple of $1 million. So to me, I think it's still about that they're going to see some authentic, I have a passion about this, I believe in this, I'm not blind to what the challenges are. And I think that will resonate with people, whether it's, $50,000 in angel financing or public investing or whatever it may be.
Yeah, I think, go ahead.
I was just going to add to both of these points. If you think about M&A and your exit, and especially what you're saying about credibility, I mean, a lot of the deals I've led, whether it's starting with a strategic investment and then you add a little more, they're 4-year relationship projects. And when you're getting to close that final deal, yes, you need a data room and you need it all the way along, but the acquirer is going to hunt on your team and on the background, on everything you've said to see that you fit, because we're going to want to pull the company in to leverage all of that. So to be truthful to yourself and honest, and even if you say you're $1 billion, the next question is going to be like, really? Well, how are you going to develop a sales channel and a distribution channel to get there? So as long as you have that answer and whatever you say, like that follows you, and maybe it doesn't work and you learned and you pivoted, but if you just do, I think I got into investing in up here, coming from Jersey to Boston and seeing a lot of people just say, I'm going to get 1% of the market. And I'm like, I could never say that at a big company to my board. They'd want to know call point, sales channel, what's the cost? So it's just having that story and having a logic behind it, but credibility and truthfulness is across the board.
Martha?
Maybe I add one
Sorry.
point to that. So you sort of talked about this 4-year relationship
Yeah.
concept of like, here we're building this relationship. And so I'll give maybe an alternative example of that, but I think the exact same concept is true. So when we ended up doing our transaction, there was 8 days between when Bristol Myers Squibb signed a CDA and when we signed all our documents and announced the transaction. We had hundreds of thousands of pages of data, tens of clinical studies, and a tremendous amount of information that there's no way it could adequately be processed in that level of detail in a short period of time.
8 days?
8 days. So there's a lot of reasons for that, and we could have a whole bunch of discussions about it. But even in that short period of time, it was even more important that we could build that trust and had that credibility right away, because there was no way they were getting to the finish line in that period of time unless they were saying, I trust that what's behind all of this is what's being presented and one in front.
Wow.
We had one meeting in New York with 50-something people there, and it was like, that was the meeting where it's like, are we going to have credibility or not? Are we going to present our story in a compelling and consistent way when they open this door and this door and this door in a data room the night before? Are we going to have the answers to those questions? And I think as much as the content of the answers that were provided that day was really important, I think the way in which they were provided and the feeling that people were left with was probably just as important in building the momentum towards that actually getting done.
It's amazing. Martha?
Yeah, 3 quick points. I'm sorry, what's your name? Terry. Okay, so 3 quick points. One is, I think that if you don't know an answer, So in med tech, when we get approval from the FDA, we don't automatically get reimbursement. That's unlike biopharma. When they get an approval, the reimbursement comes through.
Slightly more complicated than this, but
Yeah.
I get why you're saying that.
Yeah. So reimbursement for med tech is a really, really important topic for investors. And like Andrew, when I went out to try to pitch and raise money, I got dozens of no's, primarily because of reimbursement. So what we decided to do was take a different tact with the investors and say to them, and this was totally honest, we don't have all the answers. However, this is what we're going to do to figure out the answer. And this is our path that we're going to take. And we believe, given some of the intel that we have today, that this will be successful, but we don't know. By just saying we don't know, set up a trusting relationship that was really important. But two other really quick points. One is, it's really important to do what you say you're going to do. So you don't have to pick home runs. You can pick singles, but do them. And you start building trust that way. And then the second quick point is measure the heck out of everything you're doing. Create a set of metrics and scorecards so that you can quickly pivot if you need to, but also you have a way to communicate what's happening in the company to potential investors and acquirers. And there's so many little companies that, I'll advise, and they don't have a handle on what's really going on with their business. But if you can do that, it sets up a dynamic where you have, you build, you start looking like you know what you're doing.
I just want to pick up quickly one point, very common, very congruent between what Andrew said and what Martha said. And this is, when you parse the investors and you think about the pool of investors, it's okay to fail. It's even okay to fail multiple times, even 199 times. The thing you can't do is exhaust the pool of investors with a story that has failed. It is super important to be ready to change up the story after only a fraction of the pool has been used up with your first story. It's not to say you can't approach those investors again, but if you approached and they said no, even for reasons that have nothing to do with you, you have to go away for a while and not go back. Whereas others who have not been approached by you, they don't know what your story is going to be. These are private companies. These are private meetings. You can switch it up, and doing this sort of, in Silicon Valley, they talk about A/B testing. It's not quite that simple, cut and dried, but think about the investors as a large pool, and think about trying the story with small pools, and then think about making changes. That's a good way to be successful, even if initially you fail.
Just quickly, every time I got a no, I would go back and I'd do two things. I would reach out to the investor that said no, and I would either call them or email them and say, I really respect your answer, so I'm not trying to change your mind, but could you give me some more feedback so that I can, take that and learn from it? And most of the time, they gave me feedback. They wanted to help. And the second thing is, I changed my pitch deck dozens and dozens of times. I was on version AAAA because I'd gone through the alphabet and was coming back. So it's important to do that. One, to demonstrate you're hearing what they're saying.
Yeah. I mean, in this day and age, you can actually track public companies on their websites of how they're pitching themselves. If you're in a sector and you're interested in the sector, do that as an experiment. Go every week or every month on the website of a public company, which has to put its slides up. They have to display the investor documents. Look at the slides because they're evolving all the time. Download them. Evaluate month to month and quarter to quarter how they've changed because it's fascinating. Sometimes they're changing them daily. And it really does begin to give you a much more granular look at what's going on. And VC investors, private investors, they do the same thing. They pay attention. They keep your slide deck from the last time you pitched. They compare the notes with what you said the last time to make sure that you're being consistent with what you said last time. It's okay to change it, but you got to be prepared for them to be prepared. Jim?
I just wanted to make one comment about trust. I agree. This is such an important issue. When I think of myself, I know I'm an extrovert, right? But actually, you might be surprised to know that I take impeccable minutes at a meeting. And follow-up is so important. Yes or no, doesn't really matter. Our industry is a long-term series of relations. So in America, we assume trust. In other countries, you earn trust. And I think actually everybody here, regardless of your nation of origin, you should do everything you can to earn trust with your potential partners or investors or colleagues. And follow-up is really important. I like what you said a lot. I did the same thing. I don't like taking no without some feedback to positively influence the team and our approach.
Even if all it tells you is you don't want to go back to that investor again because they said no for a reason that you think is silly, right?
That's true. And and I want to come back. One other thing on trust, which I think is so important, is team building. So yes, we can talk about values and culture, and there's lots of cliches out there, but actually team building and selecting the right group of people that mesh together, that is also very trustworthy. So for example, gray hair or no hair, every small company needs somebody like that, whether it's on the board or an advisor or a colleague. There's a wisdom that comes with decades of experience versus youthful exuberance and incredible knowledge about the latest, greatest thing. So it's an admix of people that actually builds trust. And I think there's not enough attention is spent. In the backstory at Dicerna, we had a team where there were 3 people that were there for over a decade and really built the company and its culture. And that was one of the things that instilled trust in our partners, investors, and ultimately the acquirer.
It's a great point.
I think probably the same was at your company, I'm guessing.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a longevity and consistency that's there, right? And you go through transitions of what type of partners you're talking to, what type of investors you're talking to, and so certain relationships are going to transition at different points in time, but there is a sense of, here's someone who's familiar who's been there doing this. They're telling me the same thing. You could go back to our pitch deck 8 years ago, and if it said in there, what's our 5 to 10 year plan, is exactly what we were doing, right? There was a consistency in that. There was a consistency in story and messaging.
Which is unusual, I must add.
It doesn't mean that you don't tweak it and change it based on the feedback, right? I mean, I don't know how many different corporate investor decks we had, 1 million. But I think there is a sense of here's who the company is, right? And the biggest piece of that is the people you're talking to.
So before we wrap up, and I'm going to ask each panelist for a 1 minute, take home. Any other audience questions? Yes.
Thank you for the group. This has been one of the best presentations that I've been at so far this week. I had a question more directed towards Andrew. Trying to sell your company and also operate a company is 2 full-time jobs in and of itself, so you had to really trust your management team. Out of curiosity, what made you comfortable to be able to do both? And who did you kind of really lean on, and how did they make you feel comfortable to
Great
go
question.
through this process?
Yeah, it was 2 full-time jobs for a period of time. Part of what I would say too is I don't think we didn't sell our company. Someone came and bought our company, right? And I think there's a subtlety to that. And you could talk about the art of the deal and all those things. But I think part of that was we had a very small group of people who were knowledgeable about what was happening. And we had 300 other people who weren't. And so there was a weird dichotomy of that. What that turned into for me was I came and did my day job, and then my nighttime job was doing all the diligence, doing all the phone calls, answering all the questions, talking to the board and Goldman and all the advisors, right? And so there was a real dichotomy to that was frankly very stressful for a long period of time. But it was easier to do the day job part of it because that's what we've been doing for 15 years. Nothing changed. There wasn't anything to create. It was we're building this company to do this on our own. Here's all the things we need. Here's the vision. Here's what we're going to accomplish. Here's
And you're
what
10
we're
months out from
passionate
treating a patient.
about. Right. So that there was nothing hard about that part.
Right.
Right. I think the diligence part to it, et cetera, it was a lot of work and it was a lot of time, but it was talking about our product and its potential and all the data behind it in the same credible way, right? So it wasn't anything new to learn to do. It was just a lot of work in two weirdly different directions, right? And you know, that created some weird personal moments for me as well, right? I know we're going to announce selling the company tomorrow, but here I'm interviewing someone to hire the company. I'm telling the story. There's some weird things that happen like that, but
You almost needed a schizophrenia treatment.
something like that.
Thank you, Andrew. So quick wrap, final statement, Kristen?
Yeah, I would go back to knowing your story. You're not going to have the answers all along the way, but even at a high level, just a timeline, and then sharing it in your team. You've heard a lot about team, trust. That stuff all comes through when you make relationships and you start getting interviewed across the board and building out that whole journey, whether it's financial, whether it's exit, whether it's just we're at a next stage. So it goes back to story.
Thank you, Kristen. Martha?
Yeah. No, I think there's been some really important points brought up today. One thing that we didn't talk about is in medtech, generally speaking, with our startups, especially if they're in their early stage of revenue generation, the deals are usually structured, which means that you'll get a portion up front, and then the second half is an earnout based on some performance criteria. I think, and the stats are pretty bad about the percentage of the earnout that the acquired company will actually get. I think the learning there, if you're involved in a situation like that, is pay close attention to the terms of the earnout and be involved. As the key management, you are the best advocate for the business and the one who knows the most and can drive the performance of the company. So stay involved even after the acquisition. I once had a CEO say to me, well, what am I going to do? I don't think I'll stay with the company. I don't have a board to manage, so what am I going to do? And I thought that is so short-sighted because they had an earnout and they never made their earnout. So they undersold that company and it was unfortunate, but keep that in mind as you think about, it's not just about leading up to the acquisition, it's about what happens after.
Great point. Really awesome. Andrew?
Yeah, I mean, there's been a lot of different topics we've talked about. I think the one that I would pick up on that resonated a lot with me comes back to this sort of idea of credibility, and I think goes alongside with that is leadership. And I think if all of you are starting a company, or there's a small team of you, that's going to serve you well in recruiting. It's going to serve you well in pitching your company. And I think if people see that authentic passion for what you're working on, that's going to come through in knowing your business, knowing your employees, knowing what the challenges are. And you're going to develop this sense of, here's the questions that people are answering. I want to answer those questions. Maybe I don't know the answer to those questions. I want to answer those questions. And so it's this process that I think if you really live and breathe that, a lot of it is going to become, not second nature, but I think is going to serve you well, not only in a partnership situation or a transaction and how you pitch to people outside the company. It's also going to serve you well inside the company, which of course is the resources and the people and the team that you need to get to the point to have any of these conversations.
Beautiful. Thank you. Jim?
I want to leave you with a childish nursery rhyme. Mother Hubbard went to the cupboard to fetch her dog a bone. Maybe some of you know that nursery rhyme. Innovation is the cornerstone of company building, right? It can be an incremental innovation or a game-changing, dislocating change. And so for all of you out there that are involved in innovation, don't forget, optimistically, big companies, smart investors, they need new ideas. They need innovation. Don't give up on innovation. It's really what drives all of the exits. They're not about anything more than that. Of course, having good people, credible people, a good team, great advisors. That's always helpful, but innovate.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you, panel. That was an amazing one. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you guys so much. Please go downstairs to the first floor for the keynote session with Yvonne Howe. They're starting at 6, so if we leave now, we'll make it. Awesome.